Okay, I recently watched a hilarious debate on an Arabic religious program that once again reminded me of the importance of the hadith. So let's have a quick discussion about it. Cherished by Muslims for containing the instructive and edifying words and deeds of their beloved Prophet Muhammad, the hadith also serves as one of the most potent weapons, one of the most potent polemics against Islam. It is, in fact, a double-edged sword, so let's look into it. Before unpacking this strange irony, however, a little relevant background. In an earlier video, I said that although those Western people who insist that Muhammad never existed dismiss the hadith as forgeries, the hadith actually do lend credence to the existence of an Arabian prophet, though indirectly. Why did I say this? Because if they were later forgeries meant to create a sacred foundational story for Islam centering around a noble and righteous prophet, why do so many of them present Muhammad in a very unflattering light, as does the hadith we will soon be examining? The most common rebuttal to this observation, appearing in the comment section of that video, see, I do read them, went as follows.
Sir, you need to understand, things that seem strange to us moderns were normal among the Arabs of the time.
No, I do understand that. Really, I do. And even in that previous video, had given as an example the notorious Rida al-Kibir hadith, whereby Muhammad told a woman to breastfeed a man. That is, to thrust her breast in a grown man's mouth as a way of making him her son.
Brother, what's that?
Considering the conservative, patriarchic, and hyper-tribalism of 7th century Arabia, trust me when I say that Muhammad was introducing a radical and shocking idea, even then. Which brings me to my point. How the Arabic program I recently watched validated these 2 points. First, that the bizarre and unflattering accounts of Muhammad contained in the hadith contradict the idea that the hadith is a later forgery meant to give Islam a noble foundational story revolving around a pious and upright prophet. And, much more importantly, second, that the hadith, because it does capture the essence of Muhammad, remains the chief weapon against Islam. Now, the debate I watched centered around a hadith that, though long hidden, first started reaching the general populace of the Arabic-speaking world via satellite programs, I'd say around 2015-ish or so. I first wrote an article about it in 2022, link in description. This odd hadith, which I'm about to narrate, appears in several hadith collections, including the highly esteemed Musnad of Ibn Hanbal, founder of one of Islam's 4 schools of laws, or madhahib, as well as in many other well-respected Islamic texts, all of which are being taught in Al-Azhar, and all of which I have listed, volume and page numbers in the description of this video. The hadith, which is narrated by Abdullah bin Mas'ud, a companion of the Prophet, and one of Islam's most reliable and trustworthy transmitters of a hadith, goes as follows. Brace yourself. Abdullah begins by telling us that Muhammad called on him to accompany him on a trip into the desert. When they reached a certain place and night had fallen, Muhammad made a line in the sand, most likely a circle, and told Abdullah, quote, "Stay behind this line and do not cross it, for if you do, you will die." Muhammad then left his startled companion and walked into the desert night, about the distance of a hurled stone, says Abdullah. Before long, our narrator saw a group of men, he does not specify how many, who, quote, appeared to be al-Zutt. He describes them as, quote, tall, lean, and naked. Other Islamic sources say these Zutt were a black-skinned people, and we'll get into that later. After describing them, Abdullah goes on, and here's the problematic part, to say, quote, they went to and began to ride the Prophet of Allah. Literally, that's what the Arabic says. These tall, black, naked men rode Muhammad. The Arabic word yarkabun, which I will presently discuss, can also be translated as mounted. And they did this all night long, says Abdullah. During which time they would also come and circle around and try to reach him, but they were prevented, apparently from the line of protection Muhammad had drawn in the sand for his companion. Abdullah concludes his narration, quote, I was extremely terrified by them, so I sat down. With the coming of dawn, they began to depart. Then the Prophet of Allah returned, slowly and in pain, from that which they did while riding him. According to another narration found in several Islamic texts, including Akhbar Mecca by al-Fakahi, Muhammad complained to Abdullah that, quote, they wounded me all night long, at which point the Prophet proceeds to lay his head and fall asleep in Abdullah's lap. Needless to say, the highly unflattering implications of this hadith are clear. But it becomes even more scandalous once one brings in what several other Islamic reference books and histories say. For starters, who are these al-Zutt, these naked men who rode Muhammad all night long? According to Islam's written records, they were a migrant people from India or modern-day Pakistan. described in the sources as very tall, very dark-skinned, very lean, strong and hardy, and often used for labor-intensive work. In early Arabic ethnographies and literary works, al-Zutt are also depicted as being very sexual and virile, with very large penises. In fact, according to one Arabic source, al-Tashibihat by Ibn Abi Awn, quote, "The penis of al-Zutt never weakens," meaning their large phalluses never go limp and are ever ready. I'm sorry for the crude language, but this is what the Islamic texts say, verbatim. Now let's talk about the Arabic word translated as ride, as in al-Zutt rode the Prophet. Not only does it have the same exact meaning in English, as in to ride a horse, for example, but it carries the same slang meaning, as in copulating with a woman. In fact, several Islamic sources use it literally to mean sex. For example, while commenting on the famous hadith, also in Musnad ibn Hanbal, where Muhammad says, quote, "Women, dogs, and donkeys cancel a man's prayer," al-Qurtubi, one of Islam's most celebrated commentators of the Quran, elaborates by saying, quote, "A woman may be compared to a cow, horse, or camel, for all are ridden." It's also interesting to note that when al-Zutt begins circling and trying to reach our terrified narrator, Abdullah, his first instinct was to sit down. Was he trying to hide and protect that one part of his body, which these naked men were apparently trying to access? That is, his bottom, by sitting down. Again, as I think you can see, this hadith is scandalous. Not the sort of thing you'd expect people who want to fabricate an honorable prophet would make up. Nor, I can assure you, was such a deed, done hidden in the desert night, deemed normal or acceptable among the Arabs of Muhammad's time. Now, during the debates I've watched over this hadith, others, including many former Muslims, regularly make even more troubling connections. For example, they cite the well-known hadith where Muhammad is asked, quote, "Will the people of paradise have sex?" And his answer, quote, "Yes, with a vagina that never tires and a penis that never weakens." The phrase "a penis that never weakens" is identical to the aforementioned description of al-Zutt's genitalia, suggesting, as many former Muslims are quick to point out, that Muhammad so enjoyed his night with these naked black men that he went on to secretly enshrine its most notable aspect, powerful penises that never weaken or slacken, as a characterization of paradise, and possibly as an inside joke with himself. To sum up, based on numerous Islamic texts, especially Musnad ibn Hanbal and al-Qurtubi's tafsir, and several other historical and ethnographical texts, again, see this video's description for references, how this hadith is understood, especially by ex-Muslims who cite it as cause for their apostasy, is as follows. And before I proceed, please note that the following summary is not based on my thoughts or words, but rather the words of, first, as we saw, well-respected Muslim texts, and second, those who use this hadith as a polemic against Islam. I'm trying to give you an idea of what is being said and how this hadith is being presented in these debates that often flare out between Muslims. All right, here we go. Muhammad took his close companion, Abdullah, into the desert at night. He warned him to wait behind a line and went off at a distance, apparently for a pre-planned rendezvous. Before long, Abdullah saw several naked men from the people of al-Zutt appear, described in the sources as tall, lean, virile, and with large penises. These men then took turns riding or mounting the Prophet all night long. They also tried to reach him, but Abdullah immediately sat down, apparently to protect that one part of his body they were trying to access. As the sun rose, these naked men began to depart, even as Muhammad returned in pain, limping towards Abdullah and saying how al-Zutt had injured him. He then lays in his companion's lap and falls asleep. Finally, as a reflection of what Muhammad thought of that night, he went on to enshrine it as an aspect of paradise where the, quote, "penis never weakens," end quote. Okay, that's what's being said and what loud shouting matches take place over. I've personally watched several satellite Arabic language shows where Muslims call in and ask an expert sheikh about this hadith. Typical responses are that 1. Al-Zutt were not humans, but rather jinn. 2. This occurred during Muhammad's famous meeting with the jinn, known in Islamic tradition as the Night of the Jinn, when the Prophet recited the Quran to them. And 3, it's known that Abdullah bin Mas'ud was not present with Muhammad during the Night of the Jinn, so therefore this hadith must be weak and likely fabricated. Such are the responses against this hadith. As we have seen, however, and as those who use this hadith as a polemic against Islam point out, the earliest references to al-Zutt all depict them as humans. And dismissing the hadith as weak on the claim that Abdullah was not present for the Night of the Jinn is itself very weak, since the night in question had nothing to do with the jinn. meaning there is no reason to doubt the words of Abdullah, a chief and highly trusted transmitter of hadith. By the way, I decided to ask ChatGPT what it thought were innocent and non-loaded questions, and as might be expected, it answered me honestly enough. First, I asked it whether al-Zutt were humans or jinn, to which it responded, quote, in Muslim historical sources, the Zutt were consistently described as humans, not jinn. They were portrayed as a real ethnic group, most often associated with India or Sindh, modern-day Pakistan, and as a migrant labor or military class. They are also described as a rebellious and militarily capable people. I then asked ChatGPT to give me a physical description of al-Zutt based on early Arabic sources, and it said, quote, in literary and anecdotal texts, they are grouped together with other southern or dark-skinned people, all of whom have the following traits: sexual potency, prominent genitalia, and associations with physical strength and virility. Anyway, so there you have it. Here is a perfect example of why the hadith should not be so quickly dismissed as later forgeries meant to present an honorable prophet, and here is a perfect example of how the hadith is being used as a powerful weapon against Islam.